Okay, so we are going to begin, and as I described in the other video, we're going to begin by constructing one of the buildings. We're going to construct the Manor Building, which is the larger of them, and it's shown right here. But actually, what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the artwork because we've already decided we're going to rip this apart anyway, or for the most part, not use it except for when it comes to this kind of thing. So that artwork, we're just going to cut this out and then glue our manor building in place. Okay, we are getting ready to begin. We're going to do this methodically. I apologize in advance for any of the shaking of the camera that happens because it is tethered or it is on a clamp. And whenever I touch the table, the camera is going to move. So hopefully I will be able to keep that to a minimum. The important thing to note here is that when cutting this cardstock, cutting anything, the X-Acto blades that are being used are important to note. This is not a number 11, this is a number 16. And this is a special kind of a paper cutting or X-Acto blade. And it has been shown through our eons of cutting existence that this kind of a blade is very good for turning corners and is extremely sharp. So don't try this at home. All those kinds of warnings apply. You'll also note that because this is not a number 11, this is a number 16, there is a difference in its shape, obviously, and also the less concern is the extreme tip of that blade. And the number 11 blades are very much like a scalpel. And those little tiny, a micron size of metal on the end of those number 11s can actually break. And that becomes a very big danger, especially when you're cutting anything harder than paper. So we've stopped actually using those number 11s whenever possible. The number 16 is apparently a much better tip. Whether it's a different steel, we don't know. But the fact of the matter is, it's a much more precise and nice, safer to use in my view. So we'll be using that. What we're going to do is we're going to cut uh, this artwork out because although we hesitate to do it, the fact of the matter is we actually have another copy of this, and I believe they're still available. So you can get as many copies as you want, but we are going to use this actual artwork as opposed to making a copy and then cutting it because this is a coated cardstock, and it is better to use this than normal paper, which we would have to coat to keep the laser ink toner from coming off. You'll also note there is a shadow because of the manufacturing of these books. That shadow is caused by the seam where the paper is put together, and that is a concern for how it goes together. So we can glue this down on our mat board, but that little rise is actually kind of a problem. And once we cut this out, of course, it'll be a little less prominent, but it does have to be mitigated. We'll have to curl this after cutting out and get that to be down as much as possible. When we do glue it to the substrate, well, in this case, it's a piece of mat board. We're hoping that that will be dealt with. So anyway, we'll start with cutting that out. Now, also note that in this particular case, such a large cutting area doesn't really require this number 16 blade. We're going to use a normal utility blade, and I don't know how sharp it is. I'm about to find out if it's an acceptable sharpness. And of course, in this situation, it's extremely important to use a metal ruler. Okay, now you can see how that can be a problem. That curve is definitely a problem. So we have to handle that in due course here. Seeing maybe if we can bend it, curl it back, flatten it out. We want to be careful as well because of this coating of the cardstock, the glossy nature of it, that when it comes to these folds, these seams, you don't take that ink off when you go to rub it. So you want to use something like a fingernail and not wipe off that ink, because it will, like any paper product, begin to wear. And of course, if we wanted to, we could put a couple of books on this, something extremely heavy, and flatten that out. We're just going to bend this up. And I know it seems meticulous, doesn't it? It seems like, well, geez, why, Terry? What's the point? Why so worried about it? And I can tell you why, because in the other times that we've done this, that little curl that's in the paper, in the cardstock, it can become a problem. So we're going to flatten that out just by bending it in the opposite direction. And then we'll see how it behaves, and then put down our walls as we cut them out. So what I'm going to do is I will stop the recording. I won't show all the cutting that we're doing because of the fact that it takes time, and we'll simply come back when we're ready to put the artwork in place. Okay, we are continuing with the assembly, having cut the roof pieces apart. And just so everybody can see, this is the structure that we are building right here, this one right here. And what's important to know about this is that there's a roof here, another receiving part of the roof here, and here in the back. You can't see it from this angle, but you'll also note there is the tile as you would see in a Spanish type building, well, obviously Roman, Italian. This tile is the roof seam. On the other piece, it wasn't obvious at first until we analyzed. In other words, we were taking our time and we analyzed how we were going to put this together. And we discovered that you might think it should go like this. But no, when you analyze the piece, it's going to be inverted fold, not folded as you might have thought. And then these two pieces go together. You'll also note that there's a dashed line. That is the fold line. The intention for the designer of this item was that that dashed line should be covered so that it doesn't show up on the finished model. You actually overlap that dashed line a little bit so it disappears. And then fold the whole piece as one. So this is the gluing area right here. This is the fold line. So you want to make sure that, again, testing the pieces, that when you put them together, they actually do go together, and actually that little dashed line is going to show up a little bit. Well, that's nothing to worry about per se, but it's of note that when you put these pieces together and then fold them, that is going to show. That's okay. We've seen this before. What we're going to do is we're going to use match that color with paint and cover it up if we think it's necessary. But that is essentially how this roof is going to go together. So then the other thing to note is that we're going to be using contact cement, whereas we don't normally do that. Why? Sometimes glue stick or other types of glues just aren't good enough. We're going to be using contact cement kind of one of the first times we've tried this contact cement use. And what's important to note is on a lot of these contact cements, this one's Elmer's, there's a little applicator inside the lid. We're not going to use that because it's huge. We are going to sacrifice one of our uh, paintbrushes, which is again a good thing to note. Always have plenty of good, relatively good quality paintbrushes that you can dispense with. You don't really need, but they're good to have. And you'll also note this kind of a blade, we'll call it. This is why you have such blades like this. The hairs of this brush. It's a straight cut, and that is a perfect smaller applicator than what's in the jar, and it is a perfect amount of volume to spread on that. Again, we don't always use contact cement, so we're a little leery about how it's going to turn out, but we're going to give it a shot. Now, we've done that. I'm going to check something because if we need to leave this, how can we store that paintbrush for use again? I'm reading to see if I can store this in a small jar. And I don't know. It doesn't seem to indicate if I can store this in a small container of thinner. And I don't even know if I want to do that. We'll have to just risk it. I suppose I could test it. Not isopropyl alcohol, more like paint thinner, because this is a rubber compound. I do not know how this is going to work. We're going to check our seam. Looks good. And we're getting ready. Now you see here, there is when you bend it, there's going to be a white. We may have to add some more. I think we need to add glue in there because that looks like it is coming off. All right, that might be a fail because that should be a better bond than I expected. And I'm glad we're testing this because this should be a better bond than that. That seems to be almost peeling off, and that's disappointing. Normally when we do this, we use hot glue because the bond is assured and it's immediate. In this case, I'm not too crazy about what's going on here. And I was going to recommend that before you even do this, make a copy. Actually scan it, make a copy of the pieces in case of an error. And I'm just going to have to wait and see what happens here. That bond is disappointing. It should be better than that. That's the reason for contact cement. We're going to have to pause here and see what happens. And suffice to say, I'm not confident about that glue. Okay, we are back. We have some interesting updates to make available. As many of you know, these working on paper models always has a challenge to it. And these books from Usborne are no exception. The beauty, of course, of paper models is that they have zero, almost literally zero weight, which means in storage they don't weigh hardly anything, which is beneficial. Now, on the other hand, on the game table, sometimes the paper models could use a little weight, which can be satisfied by a nickel or pennies or washers, either stuck to the inside or bottom or dropped in. In any case, there are advantages, but the disadvantages are equally in number. One of the disadvantages is, of course, in that the design. Now, the design of these are excellent, frankly. So these are excellent models. They are three-dimensional in that you can see that there is a representation of columns, and then in the background of the ground floor there are doors. This kind of construction is relatively rare to see in paper models because usually it's just suggested and it would be just flat art. But this is actually a three-dimensional hallway in the model, and it is nicely designed and was not difficult to put together. I can't really say anything about this particular building. This is one of the barracks that's involved in the Roman fort. Again, for 1/72 scale, this would be huge, and so it's way out of scale. It's not really usable, but it's a representation, and that's really what we're shooting for. If this was going to be a real in-scale item, just like any other building, it would be tiny, because a unit occupying this much space on the game table represents about 250 men. That's a whole cohort or war band. That's a lot of space. So this clearly is meant to be on a 1-to-1 scale, where an actual model would represent one person. So it's just, for us, it's a representation that we're putting on the game table because it just looks really darn nice. Now, the warnings. Here is an example of warnings. This model could have been designed a little bit better. I have accomplished it, but it could have used a little bit of shortcutting by the designer. For instance, in this case, the three-dimensional aspects could have been better printed, I suppose you could say, or laid out, in that it wasn't really necessary to have this excuse me, roof attached to the column structure that would go down into the courtyard and be glued. What could have happened here is that the designer could have just simply not attach the column and awning eaves trough of the roof, he could have designed it as a separate item, and that could have been separately attached. Having it attached in the graphic and then folded into position was a difficult thing to achieve. And here we can see some of the downsides of doing that. The roof structure here is a fairly complicated way of attaching, and it wasn't 100%. I screwed up on a couple of instances. It's okay. It does remind me, or it does signify that to do this again, I would probably start in a different manner. It did work out fairly well. It's a nice manor building. What's interesting to note about it is that there are no windows or entryway on this side of the building, so that's kind of interesting. And here you see the courtyard. Here you see there's a little bit of a screw up again on my part because it was difficult to get these angles and then glue them into position. That was really the hardest part of doing this, was this gluing business of these columns. And here we see a fail. One of these columns has failed because it just didn't quite make the alignment. So that's where I say the designer should have just done the roof separate from this awning and eaves trough and column structure, and then let the person making the model put this separately. So in other words, you would install all the roof of this thing would be installed, and then you would this, I'm guessing here, then you would put on these columns, or don't even do the columns at all and have the person doing the model actually use matchsticks to put them in place, because that would have been a lot easier than trying to get this stuff to glue in position as a model, fold up, and then counter folding and opposite folding and all that kind of business. If these were just square dowel columns, it would have been probably a lot easier. And if I were to do this again, I would skip this from the fold. I would fold down the roof, as you see here, because it's angled for the water to run off, and then I would simply put in square dowel for those columns. And again, here on this building, I could have done the same thing. I could have skipped putting in this graphic, and I could have just put in square dowel. As a matter of fact, not a bad idea for future reference. Maybe for the other models, I'll actually use square dowel and put it in position. Of course, I have to paint it, but at this time, it's no big deal. So here's an example, again, with the Roman fort from Usborne. Here's an example of how the artwork looks for the walls. In this particular case, it's the gate. This is not too bad. As a matter of fact, after the first one I made, I learned how to fold and how to cheat and how to do it better. An example is this right here. The opposite side of the card is where this door goes. So you cut this door out and you put it behind this one. So you turn this over and you glue it in position. So before I even start, I take this, I cut it out, and then I stick it on the back here in position. The reason I know where it is because I just trace a cut line of this door, and then I put it on the back where it should belong. And then, of course, you see there's all these dotted lines, which are fold lines. This here is to be cut out, which is not that bad, giving the number 16 blade here. So that's an relatively easy thing to cut out. And then all these tabs, and then you fold and fold and fold. And this is the roof of the gate structure. And that's an opposite fold. So you fold these over and then you fold it up, and that becomes the flat. And here's how it comes out. So this is where I was saying that the door gets pasted on the inside. There's really nice little graphics that are inserted for the side walls of the gate. And by the way, if somebody would do this for the Cemetery Ridge or Cemetery Hill graphic structure in the Battle of Gettysburg, that would be fantastic, because look, that was really kind of easy to do. These are relatively easy to do. So these, again, here's the roof that's folded opposite. This folds over, this folds up, and then is glued down with all the tabs that are made available in the graphic. So these are actually pretty cool. There's one more to do. So in the end, what happens, this is the last one to do, but these are the gates, not the corners of the fort. These are the 4 gates that are around the model. So that's how this essentially is going to look. There's going to be a wall with a corner tower, wall, then a wall with a corner tower, and so on all the way around. And then our main court, our manor building, and then one of our barracks. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to not do all the buildings necessary. We're just going to do these and the corners of the fort, and then of course the walls, and then pretty much call it a day. Now there's another option we have purchased to download for a different kind of a fort. It's a desert fort, and we're going to be working on that as an option later on in this immediate series.